Today I'm going to show you some special effects using some things that I found in the kitchen, mainly rock salt and rice. The first one I'm going to start with is salt, just to show you some effects that you can apply to different paper surfaces and what can happen. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tape the watercolour paper to the board. I've got an old board here which I did some experimental bleeding of colours just to see what happens, but I didn't like the way they turned out. I could possibly work back into it. Anyway, so for this process, which is called texturing with salt, texturing with rice, just to see what happens. Sometimes these things work and other times they don't, and that's okay. I've had many happy mistakes and sort of not really worked out exactly what's going to happen, and then the final results are quite a nice surprise. I like having nice surprises that I don't really sort of predict, so this is not a predictable piece. You can try and use other things as well, but salt has a little bit of a bleaching aspect to it, so you'll see the difference between the salt and the rice. So firstly, I'm going to do a wash of water through it. So we tape it down so that the paper doesn't buckle. I've got it on a piece of old cardboard, which is essentially just the back of a sketch block, which I often use and keep to stretch my paper. The paper I've used is cold press 300 GSM watercolour paper, which you can buy from most art suppliers. It is a bit more expensive than cartridge. I wouldn't recommend you buy and use cartridge for this because it does buckle even if you do stretch it. So it is something that you do need to use with a little bit of watercolour. So what I'm going to try is I'm going to try a little bit of green, which is a Pthalo Green, one of my favourite greens. Put it in a just in a dish here, and a little bit of blue. I'm going to try and use a little bit of acrylic blue because it's a bright coloured blue, just to see what happens, and maybe some indigo watercolour, Winston and Newton, if I can get this open. It's not going to open for me. Okay. All right, we'll just try with these to start with. Have a little bit of water here. Always have a towel on your lap so that you can wipe your hands. Okay. So the paper is quite wet. If you look at it from an angle, you can see. And some of these splodges, which I accidentally splattered, have already started to run. I use a nice wide brush to achieve this. This is just an ordinary household brush. Plenty of water. Drop a little bit of water into a little dish to make it a bit more liquefied. Oh yes, lovely colour. And just might use another glass so that I try and use clear water because I don't want to change the colour. As soon as you start putting a little bit of a different colour, it does change it to a different hue. Okay, this is quite liquefied, maybe a bit too much as a strong pigment. I might just apply it liberally across your page. And then just wash it out a little bit and then apply the green. Whoa, that looks fantastic. What a gorgeous colour that is. Love it. Love the way that it's bleeding in. You can tilt it if you want it to bleed in, but I don't want it to bleed in that much. I'm going to add just a little bit of yellow because I think it's important, just on the side here. to drop some yellow in with a slightly different brush. Okay, see what happens. Now the yellow will turn it somewhat more of an olive green. Okay, just want to add a little bit of colour there. Just really quickly, grab the big brush. You have to work quite fast with this technique, like that. Okay, I feel like I've got a little bit too much pigment on here, so I might just take some of it off. Okay, pop that in here. Then with my rock salt, I'm just going to sprinkle it on the top, just like that. You can use ordinary salt, that's a lot more refined. You don't get the same sort of effects as this. So this is merely experimental, and you'll see how it's pooling. Might put a little bit more colour. How it's pooling around the salt grains. That's where you're going to get a little bit of a different effect happening, so you can see it down here. Okay, now my next thing is just to essentially leave it. You can add a little bit more colour if you want to add a little bit more yellow. So I might just drop some pigment in here. It's starting to dry because it's not, this yellow isn't bleeding, so it means it's not liquefied enough. Just to pop it in here. Here. Okay, you can be quite liberal with it. You can just keep building surfaces, which is really quite lovely. All right, so that's with the salt. And then I'm going to use a different brush and just guide the pigment. Oops, it's okay. I should have cleaned it. Okay, just guide the pigment around in here. Now you can use and absorb it with a tissue if you want to create some sort of a landscape. I'm seeing a mountain there. Don't know what that is, but anyway, it'll be something. Okay, you can move some of these out a little bit, maybe put a few more. So what you can do is, if you can get, this is a pink Himalayan rock salt that I'm using, but you can get salt that has smaller grains. So essentially you could work with the really big grains in the foreground and the smaller grains in the background, so that it shows that the I'm trying to achieve like a bit of a flower field without having to paint the flowers in all the way through. That's about it. Have a look in here. Now you can be quite liberal. I didn't want it to be completely even. There's areas in here that don't have a lot, which I'll work with later. And now all I have to do is leave that to dry for 24 hours and come back and shake off all the salt. As you can see, you can move it around. You've got some pooling happening, so I will take that off. Once again, you can salvage the salt. I wouldn't use it, but okay. So as you can see here, the salt actually leaves a really interesting layer of crystals. I don't know if you can see it with. I'll just put this out of the way. It sort of shimmers in the light. I really think the salt worked even better than the rice, because you can actually see the textures that have been left behind. So, and once again, just take off some of this. Oh, that's what I mean. See, it's tearing the paper, which it shouldn't do, but it's meant to be low tack. Oops, doesn't really matter. Okay. All right, so you have an interesting thing that you can work with. Now you can reapply. I'm going to reapply some tape now, some fresh tape, because I want to tape it down to the board. I'm going to try and get all the grain off it. All right, okay. Quite a lot of fun to watch what you can actually do with special effects and papers, and how to achieve different things. Okay, so I might just stretch it a little bit there, maybe not the whole way. Okay, and so I'll get, I'll just pop that in there, and maybe get some, do a little bit of a watercolor study. Now in here I can actually see a little bit of a mountain in here and a few clouds. It looks like a little bit of a Turner where there's, I actually lifted a little bit of the color because it was pooling and I didn't want that to happen. So you can use a few different brushes. Okay, so with some water, like the watercolors, I can see a little bit of a mountain in the distance. So what I'll do, this is completely dry, I'll just wet it, or I think I might just drop some colour in just to see what happens. Okay, and I might use a little bit of the blue that's already there, a smidget, a tiny bit, and a little bit of the, oh, actually indigo would probably be, I couldn't open that the other day. No, it's a bit stuck. Okay, maybe just put a little bit of black on it. That's white. Okay, that's carbon black. It's not the same paint. I'm just going to put just a dab just to change it a bit, that's all. And just a bit of blue. There we go. Just to dull the blue and what we call desaturating. You've got to be very careful, but sometimes it actually dries up so fast. I don't want it to dry up. Okay. And just going to drop a bit of colour in there and let it do its thing. Okay, now that will only run where I've put water. You can move it around if you want, but I prefer not to. So I might even put a little bit in there. And you might want to use a different brush just to move. I quite like what it's doing in this section here. It's just pulling, it's just giving you a little bit of contrast. And sometimes before it dries up, you can add a tiny little bit of detail if you want some areas just to be more defined. Like so. Okay. I'll let that dry and then I might put a little mountain in the background. And what I'm intending to do, this is like a bit of a field of flowers. Usually with the salt, you can see here, it leaves a mark in the middle and then it leaves a little bit of a circle, almost like it's been bleached out, where you can highlight those areas. So what you can do is you can go over the top of it with a little bit of white just to bring it out a bit. Not too much, not too precious. I'm using two different paints here. So I'm using the Art Spectrum and I'm also using a little bit of acrylic. So it doesn't really matter what you use. I mean, most people like to use one or the other. If you're doing watercolour, it's probably best to use the Art Spectrums. I just happen to run out of certain colours. So my whole objective is not to spend too much money and just to do what I've got from home. So you might want to use a bit of a dry brush technique. So dry brush technique essentially involves that's too much water. So that means that my brush is too dry. It's too wet, sorry. So you just dry it off with a towel. Okay, and you might want to have a little bit of a piece of paper and experiment just on the side, like so. So it should be just picking up a little bit of pigment. You don't want it to be really white. So I might try just on the side, and there's a little flower that I can see here. So you might just make that a bit white around here. So what you're doing is you're actually bringing out the white areas. And I will show you in another series how to sort of lift flowers from pools of colour. You do have to have an idea of the type of flower you'd like to put in. I sort of use poppies a lot to do that, because poppies have these papery, floppy type of leaves that lend themselves to this particular technique, where you'll just be lifting colour off and then reapplying it again. So you can buy a white ink, which is quite nice too, but it's not as opaque as applying some either watercolour paint in a thick consistency, in my case some acrylic. Now this doesn't have to be a scene at all, it can just be an abstract thing. I quite like abstractions. It's just you don't have to worry too much about the representation of what you're doing. You can play with it for a long time, and yeah, it just keeps evolving, which is really lovely. And the beauty about it, most people say, oh, I can't draw if I'm not a good artist. I get that a lot as a teacher, especially with high school students. You don't have to draw. You can just be creative by mark making, and this is all about mark making. It's so satisfying just to make marks, have a bit of fun. And sometimes you have to put it away and you think, okay, some of my pieces that haven't worked out, I thought haven't worked out, I've just left them for a few months, and then I've gone back to them even 2 or 3 years later and just used it and think, oh, okay, well, I can use that to make something else, to create another work of art. So if you can, hang on to it. It's got a little bit too much paint. It's just the process of understanding what you can do. As I say to students a lot, it might take 10 paintings before you get one that you think is okay. And sometimes what you think is not okay, somebody else thinks it's okay. And that's happened to me in exhibitions where things have gone terribly wrong, whether it's a sculpture, a glass work that I've done, or a little study like this. And I've actually won awards, which is almost a joke. So you just never know. I suspect that, as the old saying goes, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Okay, so I'm just working around some of these whiter areas and just highlighting them and bringing them out a little bit. Some of them I've made them quite round and others not so round. Now you can make them quite big around in the foreground over here, because obviously in the foreground you can see a lot more detail. I mean, if I was to do this again, I would think a little bit better about the choice of my green. I think it's a little bit too tealy coloured. I need it to be a little bit more of a leaf green or a frog green, or maybe even a eucalyptus green may have been a bit better. But it was just an experiment to show you what you can achieve just by using grains of salt. So you can start balancing out. I'm looking at, okay, I've got white in these areas. I need to go back in and put some more white in here. So these ones are probably a little bit too big because they're meant to be in the foreground. And what you can do, if you want these to be in the background, they should have been smaller grains of salt. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this bit the foreground. So it's like long reeds that you're looking through, and then you see the background of the flowers rather than, and then you can put some tiny little dots of the green just to indicate, so that you create a little bit more depth. At the moment there's not a lot of depth in this. So dry brush technique, there's not a lot of water on my brush at the moment. I'm just picking up the pigment, and my brush is dry, and it's just sort of smudging it and rubbing it and blending it into the salt grain imprint to create a little bit of a circle and to create a little bit of contrast. That mountain's drying up quite nicely, and I like the way that it's pulled in there. I don't want it to be too dark because I don't want it to dominate. And this is not, I haven't used any photos or anything, I just sort of made it up as I went. You may not want to do the mountain at all. Might just want to leave it as it is. Might not want to do all of them. I hope that's a little bit too much. I think the contrast of the white looks quite nice. Okay, put that in there. I could keep going with it, but I'm not going to. I might add a tiny little bit of contrast, and I'm looking at the colour wheel because we're using green. It might be nice to actually put a tiny little bit of red in the centre. So just test out the red. Just a little bit of red in the centre, just to create some interest. Dab it on, contrasting beautifully with the green. Okay. And then what you might want to do is you want to get a bit more green. And just drag some little lines. You might make them green, less teal, and a little bit of yellow. See what happens. Maybe mix it up on here just to see. It's a bit dark. That looks all right. Now, normally I would use a rigger brush. I don't seem to have one. So a rigger brush is essentially a brush that has a really, really long bristle, like twice the size, and it's quite thin and narrow, and you just drag it and it gives you those swirly sort of wavery lines. So you don't want to have too much control. It doesn't have to be a complete straight line, it can weave its way through. So what I'm trying to do now is, because the grains were a bit big, I can't create that field of flowers. I will do in the background later. I'm trying to make the grains appear as flowers in the foreground. So it looks like taking a photo from here. So just connecting them up. Okay, you could add more if you want to, you can continue going, but I think that looks fine, what I'm trying to achieve. mountain looks like it's starting to dry. It's a little bit, still a little bit damp. So what you might want to do is to add some tiny little dots. Actually, it might be better to do them in the same green. So as it travels further away, it's pretty hard to sort of achieve the tiny dots. It's quite tedious, but you get the idea. Basically, you can really work back into this for a long time. My intention was not to work into it for a long time. It's just to play with the colour, show you what you can create with salt. You could probably do this with bigger grains of salt on a bigger piece of paper, and maybe even, you know, experiment with different colours running into each other. I mean, I'm seeing all sorts of things as I'm looking at this, and I can add to it. You know, there's like little trees and things here. I'll see if I can see what happens here, just in the distance. And it's just the marks that I can see things. You can't see the detail, but you can see little mark making. That could possibly be just a group of little trees in the distance. And these sorts of things all add a little bit of depth to your work. Okay, that's starting to take shape. I get carried away with stuff like this, so I quite like working with it. Doesn't always work, but it doesn't really matter. Now that mountain's looking pretty dry, apart from where it's, oh, even that's pulled nicely. So what you can do is with a clean brush, again, add a little bit more water. So brush it into here. And this time you might add, so essentially you're painting a mountain with water. And then you go back into your Payne's Grey, this area here. I'm not going to put a lot of colour, just going to drop something where I can see it wet. And you might just use the end of the brush to drag it down. Usually I do tip the paper so that the pigment runs into the areas that I want it to run. I sort of control it, but I've taped it down, so I'm not going to do that today. Okay, now usually that mountain should be a little bit lighter. It's not, so what I might do is, that's dry, so just add a little bit more water here to this mountain. Really play with it. And I may just add a little bit more darkness to it so that I'm bringing that mountain forward a bit more. And don't be afraid to use too much pigment. Just guide it. If you have a straw, you can also blow into it and it'll just move its way around. Usually tends to pull where there's, so this in here is dry now, so it's not going to pull. If you want to control it, you can paint it dry, but I'm not fussed. So what I'm going to go in and put a little bit of, tiny bit of black, really tiny bit of black in here, just indicate. Oops, that's not black, that's green. Okay, where is it? Just to add some darkness in these areas in here. Like so. Don't be afraid to do that if you think, oh, didn't want it that dark. Okay, so just add a little bit of black just in here. I probably need a smaller brush. This isn't small enough to do what I'm trying to achieve. Okay, that's all I'm going to do. Now, if you don't like an area, like I put this Pthalo Green in here, I'm not quite sure I do like it, so I might just take it and lift it. You can lift it before it actually dries. It'll be pretty quick with it though, because once it dries, it's harder to lift off the paper. I might go back, add some more of that olivey green in this area here. Yeah. Okay. This is still quite wet, so I might see if I can put a little bit of darkness to it, the blue. That's what I want. That's what's happening there, just that feathery line. Just exactly what I want. Sometimes it's harder to achieve that. Now you can go back in and add some yellow as well, so I might just see if I can add a little bit of, oops, it's been mixed up, a bit of yellow. And just put some yellow in some sections, put a little bit of green in it, and you can just add it in. And again, with your brush technique, blend it in. Use your fingers if you want to. You just keep adding to it. If you think that's a little bit too green, you can go back in and think, okay, I want to take a little bit of that dark green away, make it more of an olivey colour, and do that. And there you go. That's it. So I can spend a lot of time working back into this, but I'm not going to, because the whole intention of this was to show you what to do with the salt.